Just a quick note on Elia Suleiman. He is a Palestinian filmmaker. He was born in Nazareth. In 1948, when the state, Palestine, the country, Palestine, was under British colonial rule. And after World War II, like most European colonial empires, the British promised to leave after 1945. The problem in Palestine is that they had promised the Jewish populations of Europe that they would find a country in Palestine. And the bigger problem was there were other people living on the land there. And the British, instead of dealing with the problem, what they did was promise both Arabs, Palestinians and Jews who became Israelis, they promised both a state. And they withdrew. And they withdrew in 1948, and there was a war. There was the first truce that stopped the war was also in 1948. So a part of the territory of Palestine became Israel, and another part became what is known today as the occupied territories. The West Bank fell under the control of the Jordanian army, and Gaza fell under the control of the Egyptian army. So it's a schizophrenic situation. And then in 1967, another war erupted between Arab armies and Israel. This time the Arabs lost for real, and Israel invaded the West Bank and Gaza until 1993 with the signing of the Oslo Peace Accords. The Oslo Peace Accords granted funny autonomy to the PLO. The Palestine Liberation Organization became the Palestine National Authority. So the West Bank was divided in 3 zones. Zone A, the PLO had full control, security, financial control, and movement. But they had to coordinate the security with the Israelis. Zone B is mixed control. Zone C is under the control of the Israelis. The Palestinians only have the right to go through, to be in movement. It's a very strange peace agreement. The peace agreement, the Oslo Accords, were preceded by a popular insurrection known as the First Intifada. It was a rebellion from the civilian population. It started in 1987 and ended in 1989 or 1990. And it was unarmed in the sense that the Palestinians had stones and the Israeli army had its weapons. This intifada, this insurrection, intifada is Arabic for insurrection, captured the imagination of the entire world, because you saw children throwing stones on tanks. It was the reason why the Israeli government agreed to go to the peace negotiations. I mean, I don't want to give you a lesson on Palestine, but I want to tell you a few things, just so you understand, like as an opening to understanding Palestinian cinema. Palestine is a very strange case, because in the 19th century, when Darwin developed his theory of the origin of the species, he basically said, man comes from monkey. And what happened? The church goes crazy, because man is not supposed to come from monkey. Man is supposed to be from Adam and Eve and all that. And so what the church does is that it really wants to prove that it's like a Suleiman movie. What the church wants, it wants to prove that Darwin is wrong. So what do? Darwin's theories coincide with the discovery of photography. They sent priests to go on archaeological missions. They sent priests to go on archaeological missions. On the one hand, as they dig the ground, they look for biblical traces of Jesus, of Mary, of Joseph, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, they were asked to produce images, representations of Palestine, which becomes the Holy Land. Images that will convey this idea that Palestine, the Holy Land, still looks exactly like it did at the time of Christ. Why? Because we are in the Orient, because it's hot, because people are slow, mentally slow, because they have never, tasted development, or they don't understand anything about modernity. And so, because most of them are Muslim, and Islam is backwards, all these like wonderful theories. And actually, the industry of postcards becomes extremely lucrative in Europe at the time, in the 19th century. What's even more interesting is basically the missionaries, when they arrive to Jerusalem, to Jaffa, to Haifa, to Nazareth, they're shocked because they find 4-story buildings, they find a train station, they find a bank, they find people wearing shoes, and they're horrified. And so when they take the photos, you can tell how difficult it was for them to stage the photograph. And they often ask peasants to dress in a traditional way to basically look like they were the same from the time of Jesus. So to amuse you, the first thing I wanted to show you is actually a film from the British archives that actually was shot and distributed in 1960. And you'll see how the European imagination still was obsessed with this Holy Land. Because when you call Palestine Holy Land, what happens? The agency of its people is taken away from them. Because this city, Jerusalem, is so much more important than these little people living in it. It is the center of all the religions. It is where, I don't know who did, I don't know what. And so it cannot, the fate of the city cannot be decided by the people who live there. Oh, I think I don't have the sound hooked. Yeah, today is a special day. Can somebody help me? It's all Mila's fault. No, I don't even have it hooked.
It's here?
No, I need the... It's here.
It's here?
Oh, no, it's here.
First of all, let us look at the country itself. Inland from the coast stretches a land of great variety and beauty, from the sandy beaches of the Mediterranean shores to the desert hill country, bare and dry during the summer and green only in the spring. Where there is water, there are pleasant woods and pastures, especially along the rivers and where the land can be irrigated. Deserts stretch to the south and east, and there are few roads through the arid wilderness.
Few roads, because they don't have cars. 1960.
Cut through the hills, where water is precious in the tropical heat.
Tropical heat.
There for wandering man and beast. The desolate waters of the Dead Sea lie deep in the Jordan Valley, nearly 1,400 feet below sea level. And to the north, in the same valley, is the Sea of Galilee, set in one of the most fertile parts of the country. Modern cultivation has enabled the countryside nearby to regain some of the original beauty it had in biblical times, when it was the richest and most densely populated part of the country. In the valleys valleys and on hillsides terraced with vines and olives are the towns and villages with their whitewashed houses. The village threshing floor has been used in this same manner for many centuries.
Okay, that's what I wanted to show you.
Goats and sheep are tended on the hills.
Okay, so we have a very few people living there. We have goats and sheep. Anyway, so 1948, the State of Israel declares its independence. The occupied territories are in a state of limbo under Jordanian rule and under Egyptian rule in Gaza. And then in 1967, the picture changes. The people, Palestine, the people who left, I just want to say before I continue, that what's interesting about the end of the British Empire is that everywhere they left, there was massive interpopulation there was population transfer. There was a lot of bloodshed, and all the British could come up with was a plan of partition. In 1948, actually, they proposed a plan of partition for Palestine, which the borders of which are still kind of existing today. India, Pakistan, and Palestinians, when the Israelis, in 1948, when the Israeli army invaded their villages, they fled. So there was 1 million refugees. Same for India and Pakistan. South Africa is another interesting case because the apartheid regime was instituted in 1948. Anyway, so basically in 1967 you have the State of Israel, you have the Israeli army all over Palestine. The Palestinians who left for good, left Palestine, became refugees in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Syria. They're called refugees. The Palestinians who moved from a village to another village to find shelter, and then their village was destroyed, so it was impossible for them to return to their native village, so they stayed wherever they were. Their property in the original village, or their presence in the Israeli legal system, was called present absentee, meaning they were absent from their property, but they were present as in existing in real life. And this weird contradiction, present absentee, becomes I mean, if you think about it as a political identity, it's like the weirdest thing. And so it becomes the source for the absurd literature, the absurd humor, the absurd imagery and visual culture. One of the most important Palestinian writers, he had an Israeli passport, so he lived he was from Haifa, and he lived in Israel. He wrote in Hebrew and in Arabic. He was a very prominent member of the Communist Party, and in Israel, Palestine, the only thing that united Palestinians and Israelis was the Communist Party. There was one Communist Party. It was Israeli and Palestinian. And therefore, it is at the source of a lot of production of culture, of the possibilities of encounter. Anyway, so this writer was the editor of the journal of the Communist Party. His name was Emil Habibi. In the booklet, in the series of texts that I gave you, I have an excerpt from his most famous novel, known The Adventures of Said, the Pessimist. So he invented this word that comes from pessimist and optimist, pessimist. And the pessimist embodies the absurdity of the present absentee. Palestinians in Israel had to go to Israeli schools. They had to learn the Hebrew, everything. I mean, they had to become Israeli. And after a long time, a long struggle in the 70s, in the late 70s, early 80s. They were allowed to learn Arabic again. So learning Hebrew was a double-sided issue. Some wanted to speak better Hebrew than the Israelis to show them that they were smart, that they could be better than them at whatever whatever the challenge was, and others purposefully refused to learn Hebrew or learned it in a very bad way, never, only used it when they had to. The other thing, okay, let me show you. Okay, so Elia Suleiman is born in Nazareth, and at age 17, he has to, they get a word that he is wanted by the Israeli police, which means that he will spend time in jail for whatever reason. So his father tells him, smuggle, leave Israel as fast as you can, whatever way you can. He smuggles out of Israel, and this is really the early 80s, and he goes to Holland. He goes to Amsterdam, where he works in restaurants like a dishwasher, and then he meets a woman whom he marries. They move to New York, and in New York, she is doing her PhD, and he works as a ticket salesman in cinema. And this is how he learns filmmaking. He watches films all the time at the cinema for free. He met a video artist called Jay Saloom, who was living in New York. Together, they made a video. The video received a lot of attention. And then 1991, what we call the first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and the US liberated Kuwait and pushed him back. So this first Gulf War, which kind of changed the relationship of America in the Middle East, and it coincided with the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was no longer a power player to negotiate on the fate of the world. So the Americans have a free hand, and they decide to change things in the Middle East. And it was a very shocking moment in the region. And one TV station, one French TV station, I can't remember which one, commissions these short films by filmmakers thinking about the Gulf War. Elia Suleiman makes a short film that makes him incredibly famous. And it's called Homage by Assassination. And after that, he realizes he wants to be a filmmaker for real. And he writes a chronicle for a disappearance, and he shoots it he's able to shoot it in Palestine and in Israel. And the film goes to Venice, wins awards. And then he just becomes very famous. He made a second film called Divine Intervention. It was released in 2002. It was in Cannes. And then he made in 2010 a third film called The Time That Remains. What I wanted to do was show you a couple of clips from Divine Intervention and a couple of clips from The Time That Remains. The films, I'm sure you can find them on torrent or whatever, but they're also available on DVD. Elia has a very peculiar practice. He is very present in his films, but he barely ever speaks a word. He is a lot, and the facial expressions carry all the emotion. At the same, and he kind of looks like a mixture of Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. He's also clumsy, he's awkward, he's unsure of himself. He's an outsider insider. He doesn't know the power dynamics of what's going on. So it's almost like he walks into a situation a bit like a fool. But at the same time, when he enters a situation, things happen, things change. He is also like a witness. In art, especially in lived realities that are politically very dramatic and tragic. The act of bearing witness is crucial, whether it's film, whether it's video, whether it's photography. And the fact that he's always there, it's almost like he's witnessing what is going on. And because he's looking at the spectator, he's forcing you to also become a witness. He says he's very inspired from Asian cinema. So he also mentions Ozu like Djibril Diop yesterday. Okay, let's start with this from Divine Intervention. I'll explain after we see all the clips why I selected those clips. But let me turn off the lights. Sorry. It says, because I'm crazy in love with you.
יש פה איזה בלון שהעיפו, אנחנו רוצים להוריד אותו, זה אפשרי?
This is in Ramallah.
لازم تسمع. بعدين اسمع في حفل الليلة بالستونز مع دي جي اسمه كل شيء مجال لازم تيجي. عظيم 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 عظيم.
Okay, it goes on and on. The tank keeps following the average Palestinian bourgeois in Ramallah. Okay, so the reason I selected the clips may be obvious, but if you were able to see a chronicle of a disappearance, then you'll understand that Elia, a little bit like I was describing Jibril's Diop Mambeti's approach in his last films. Basically, there is a reality in which he implements a fictional setup. He implements a story, very minimal. He implements some actors, very, very few. And what happens is that it looks like, the other thing he does is he is inspired from reality, and you see a choreography. When I was here and you were watching Chronicle, the choreography between bodies is incredible. What happens is that he captures the emptiness of the time, meaning what happens to people when they are under occupation. What happens to them, their agency is compromised, they are not masters of their own destiny, and so the experience of time is not in their hands. And a lot of what they do seems pointless, vacuous, almost absurd. And this you see very much, both in Chronicle of a Disappearance and Divine Intervention. He goes further to say, in the way he represents Israeli soldiers, is that when you are a soldier, when you're born a soldier and you're a soldier or your life, when your society is so militarized that it is continuously in a state of war, you also lose your agency. You also become captive to another logic. In this scene, the French, I'm sorry, I only found it with French subtitles. The guy is telling his friend, oh, dude, you should come to the Stones tonight. There's a great DJ with like an amazing lineup. And the next scene, you see, it's a real nightclub or it was a real nightclub in Ramallah called Stones. And you see the Palestinians like dancing, and the Israeli soldiers in the tank observing them, huddled in the tank, like barely able to move. And you realize these people, you know, even if they're dancing like idiots, it's fine, but they're dancing, they're celebrating, and the other guys are like stuck in this thing, in this war machine. Elias Suleiman's cinema is, I mean, the beauty of it is that it is fed from so many other cinemas. So from Buster Keaton, from Charlie Chaplin, from Japanese and Malaysian cinema, minimalist. At the same time, we have this character, and I took I did the screen capture from his website because I think it really tells the story properly. So this character, I don't know if you've ever seen him on like pro-Palestinian t-shirts or websites or whatever. We call him Handala. And Handala is a very bitter, wild plant. And when you're hiding in the hills and you have no food, that's what you're left to eat with. And at the same time, the young character, this 10-year-old boy, was drawn by a guy who became a refugee at age 10. And and he wanted to capture the bitterness of being a refugee, especially as a child. And so his name is Najil Ali. And Handala is always in this position. His back is turned, his hands are tied behind his back. He has a patch, and his hair is like this, spiked. And he's watching the injustice, he's watching the absurdity, he's watching the craziness. I'm going to just show you some of the drawings that he made. He used to publish in newspapers in Beirut. He was assassinated in 1994. I think, yeah, 1984. He was living in Beirut. He was assassinated, and he was profoundly secular. And I think, you know, some rumors say that he was assassinated by Islamist groups. Anyway, so this is like a commentary on Arab governments. I like this because it's the witness, I mean, watching. It's kind of, I think Elia Suleiman is a lot like Handala, except that we see him. We see his eyes, we see his face. I'll show you this. This is also on representations of the life of refugees. So there's, you know, a degree of abstraction. The refugees in the camps in Lebanon were often shelled from the air. And this one I love because it says, "We won." And you see how destroyed the face of the man who says, "We won." And it's, you know, what kind of a victory is this victory? It happens at night. That crescent, we don't know if it means that it's the victory in the shadow of political Islam. The wound becomes a mouth, so you're speaking from your wound, and you are silenced, and you look like you're destitute. Yeah, it's one of my favorites. Let me see what this is. Okay, so on the Palestinian humor, I wanted to show you, Palestinian cinema. The first Palestinian, I mean, there were attempts at making films. The PLO in the 1960s and 70s was based in Beirut. And when they were based in Beirut, they understood the extreme importance of cinema. And so they trained filmmakers, they produced film. There was a film unit attached to the PLO, but also because of the international solidarity, a lot of filmmakers made films about the Palestinians. Italians, Yugoslav, Jean-Luc Godard. I don't know if you've heard of his film, Here is, and Elsewhere, Ici et Ailleurs, his most famous, I mean, one of the most famous films about the Palestinian revolution. It's really, really beautiful. It's really important. And so so this is 60s, 70s, 1982, the PLO has to leave Lebanon, and they are living in Tunis, and they're scattered. They stop making films. In 1983, the Palestinians in Israel begin to make films. The first film is called Wedding in Galilee. It's a beautiful film by a man called Michel Khleifi. And in the 80s and the 90s, you see the emergence of Palestinian cinema from Israel and from the occupied territories. One of the most well-known Palestinian filmmakers, also from Nazareth, there's a theory that a lot of the filmmakers come from Nazareth. So there's a theory about the water in Nazareth, I don't know. So his name is Hani Abu Asad. You may have heard of his film Paradise Now. And he just finished a film with Kate Winslet and Idris Elba called Something the Mountain. So he's in Hollywood now, Hani. But he made this hilarious short film.
يلا يلا انا هو شريك بحكي لك مش شريك شو مش شريك يا انت حمار انت حمار قلت لك كده كمان ركيتك كمان مش بس انت حمار انت وكل عيلتك حمار وعيلة عيلتك احمر عيلة حمير مفارجيك بيدين الحمار يعملوا العقد استنى شوية انا عندي فكرة
So maybe the thing that is most, I mean, there are so many ways to document and describe and create fictions from the reality of living in Palestine. And there are exquisite films that were made. But the reason I picked these clips is because we are now at a different level. I mean, I think these clips, these moments, incarnate different levels and incarnate kind of the mission of cinema. In Palestine, since the peace process, since 1993, the Israelis have no clue how to continue, and I don't know if they want to continue. The Palestinians have no clue how to continue, and I'm not sure they want to continue. The status quo is benefiting a very small group, and people keep enduring. In the year 2000, there was an intifada, a second intifada. This time it was armed. This time there was a lot of suicide bombing. This time it was very violent. And the end result was this wall, this construction of a wall. By the way, the cement for the wall was provided to the Israelis by a Palestinian businessman. So the situation is very complicated. Yes, like everywhere. What these clips do and what these filmmakers do is that they allow you to transgress. It's a bit like we were talking about the first day. They allow you to transgress, to go beyond the level of when the political imaginary is completely blocked. Ask anyone, any politician, any academic, any citizen today. Can you imagine a day without the wall? Even though the Berlin Wall lasted 25 years and eventually was taken down, you ask Palestinians or Israelis, and they cannot. But what happens in this moment when Elia runs and leaps over the wall? I remember when I was watching, I mean, maybe some of you will become very well-known filmmakers and your films will go to Cannes, and you will probably deserve it, but I have to say that the most cruel festival in the world is Cannes. And the most cruel moment in Cannes is the press screening, because the press are tired, they see 5 films a day, they are cynical, they text message, they drink coffee while while they're watching a film. But when I watched it in the press screening, and when Elia jumped over the wall, people applauded, because it is a moment of emancipation. It's nothing. It's just representing a transcendence, that this wall that blocks the horizon, this wall that keeps the Israelis under siege and the Palestinians under siege, this wall can be leapt over. And it's an incredible gesture. The apricot pit that explodes the tank, that's the fantasy. That's an incarnation of the worst fear of the Israelis. They think that Palestinians are able to explode anything. And when you incarnate these things, you also emancipate an imaginary. The balloon with Yasser Arafat is also it's great. It's one of the most eloquent commentaries on what the peace process wanted to be. And it's so accurate. You know, what is a balloon? It's a thin skin covered with nothing, with air. And it rises, so it makes you look up. And this, Arafat was this. He made people dream. Everybody looked up. And he hovered over Jerusalem. In the meantime, Palestinians could come and go and love each other and have, affairs. Transgress the rules of checkpoints. It's a beautiful image. So, to me, this is what remains of Palestinian cinema. I showed you Handala to explain what feeds it. The caricatures are one thing, the poetry. I could have done a deconstruction of the films according to poetic verse. They are deeply fed from poetry. And what I want to end with is actually a clip from an Israeli filmmaker, and one whose work I adore, and this is my favorite film by him. I began with the Holy Land, I end with Jerusalem. So, I don't know if you know this, but Jerusalem was a normal city for a very long time. And then it became the Holy Land. And then, especially after the Oslo Accords, in the 70s and in the 80s, people who grew up in Jerusalem remember going to bars, remember going to the Cinematheque, remember going to brothels to see prostitutes, and so on and so forth. And of course, when it became, after the peace accord, it suddenly became a holy city, then everything was transformed to conform to this religious tourism. And there is apparently a phenomenon, very well known, where people suddenly think that they have a divine calling, that they are the incarnation of Christ, of Joseph, and the Israeli filmmaker is called Eyal Sivan, and he made a gorgeous, hilarious, beautiful film called The Jerusalem Syndrome. And I wanted to end with this.
Ah, Jerusalem, the holiest place in the Holy Land. Tourists from all over the world flock to this city to be filled with the Spirit of God. They come by the busload to breathe the air of Abraham and King David, to see where Jesus was born, where he walked and lived, to go back to the time of the prophets and lose themselves in holy ecstasy until suddenly they feel different.
Hey mate, welcome.
This is John Lichtenberg. He used to be an air conditioning installer in Brisbane, Australia. He came to Jerusalem 3 years ago and stuck around to wait for the second coming of Christ.
What would happen if Jesus did come back today? Hallelujah.
John has the Jerusalem syndrome, a well-documented medical condition where sufferers identify a little too strongly with figures from the Bible. In John's case, King David. The Jerusalem syndrome was first identified in 1982 by Dr. Yair Barel of Kfar Shaul Mental Hospital.
Jerusalem sounds ideal. It's not a normal city. For the majority of the person, it sounds divine. This place, the only place that where you can speak with God.
Over the past 12 years, there have been nearly 500 reported cases of the Jerusalem syndrome.
We have about 40 tourists in a year. In hospitalization, of course, we see a lot in outpatient basis.
As a resident of Jerusalem, how does it make you feel about your city?
Oh, it's a very crazy city. A city where crazy persons arrive to live here, and in some cases the city makes people crazy.
Meet Jerry. He was once a firefighter in suburban Iowa. He and his family came out to Jerusalem to celebrate Christmas one year and never left.
I'm a full-time firefighter. I had my own construction business. I was building houses. My wife was a registered nurse. I just built a big fancy house, and I had my vehicles all paid, I had a car closet.
Now they live in a tent on some of Jerusalem's hottest real estate, a hillside where the apocalypse is supposed to start.
I gave it all up to do this.
The Jerusalem syndrome is so widespread that everyone in town seems to know the symptoms, including psychiatrist Eli Wittstone.
There was a guy who was living in a hotel. He went to the chef, to the kitchen, and he demanded to prepare the last meal.
We've had them by the dozens who came to be the two witnesses spoken of in the book of Revelation.
They may have adopted sort of robes and turbans and sandals.
So they forget about English, they don't know English anymore, and they speak tongues. There was a case of one girl who just stripped herself and walked around naked.
He fasted for 40 days. There's no food, just water, 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 water.
We had one case where the fellow even tried to eat his shoes.
They hear voices, they have visions, and usually they prepare in a way that they have to be contained, they have to be taken to a mental hospital.
Right back to Kafar Shaul Mental Hospital and Dr. Barel.
What type of people does it affect?
Oh, one of the interesting things is that from 42 cases, one Jew, one Catholic, 4 Catholics.
This is the day.
I wanted to observe a normal tourist in the early stages of the Jerusalem syndrome. So I decided to go undercover with a Protestant group from Ohio. As we toured the city, I watched for tourists who were on the edge.
Me, oh, I like that camel too, baby. We'll just get on that thing and ride up and down.
Tourists like Jim.
You ever been on a camel ride?
If you were in the Holy Sepulchre and you heard a little voice in your head saying, "You are the second coming of Jesus Christ," what would you do?
I have no idea. That might be a great, great feeling beyond.
Or Bob.
There's a tree exactly like this is where the crown of thorns came from.
He wanted to make himself a crown of thorns.
They talk about thorns over there, and they don't even realize they're so big, and this is right here. They think we little jaggers or something.
I feel God is speaking to me.
And there was Earl and his 2 grandsons at the Western Wall.
So where were you when the Lord spoke to you?
We were on the balcony of our room at the Ramada Inn here in town.
Hallelujah.
Praise the Lord. Then it happened. Word came an American tourist had come down with the Jerusalem syndrome. So I rushed over to his hostel, where my friend Dr. Wittstone was making an evaluation.
I saw the resurrection of the dead outside my efficiency apartment, and I'm ready to start serving the Lord as soon as I can.
His name was Joe Kuhn, and he came from South Carolina.
One of the things that was revealed to me was that the chosen people of God were all dead. The Hebrews were all dead. And in order to fulfill that prophecy, they would all have to be raised from the dead.
When the time comes, you'll be helping to raise the Hebrews from their graves?
I think I can fulfill those prophecies, yes.
While Joe showed all the classic symptoms, he was a relatively harmless casualty, especially compared to the most famous case of the Jerusalem syndrome, a rock musician from Waco, Texas.
God.
David Koresh decided he was the Messiah on a visit to Jerusalem in 1983. Fortunately, most sufferers don't end up like him. They either turn into harmless religious eccentrics like King David, or they snap out of the syndrome altogether and go back to their old lives. And I'm happy to report that no one from my tour group went home any crazier than they arrived. This time.
That's it.